Joel pressed play. The machine stuttered. The tape heads engaged with a mechanical groan that said 30 years of dust and disuse. Then the reels began to turn, static first, then a hiss, then silence of a different quality. Not empty silence, but recorded silence. The specific texture of a room captured on magnetic tape, ambient noise compressed into something that felt like held breath. Then a voice, a child's voice. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, speaking in the careful, slightly too formal way of a child who knows they are being recorded and is trying to sound important. My name is Danny Beaumont. Today is October 14th, 1974, and I want to say what I saw because nobody believes me, and I think someone should know. Joel's hand stopped moving. He had not done it before, and found a reel-to-reel tape recorder sealed inside a wall cavity. He had not pressed play on a machine pulled from a wall and heard a missing child's voice. Danny Beaumont had disappeared from the town of Carvers Creek, Ohio, on October 19, 1974. 5 days after this recording was made, he had never been found. And now his voice was filling a gutted radio station at 11:23 on a Tuesday morning, 50 years later, telling Joel Marsh exactly what he saw. What did Danny Beaumont see in October 1974? And why did someone seal his voice inside a wall? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe that some voices deserve to be heard, no matter how long they've been buried, subscribe, because what came off that tape changed everything. The building that had been WCKR Radio sat on the corner of Elm and 4th in Carvers Creek, Ohio. A 2-story brick structure built in 1948, the year the station launched, and occupied continuously until 1991 when the license lapsed and the equipment went dark, and the building was sold to a series of owners who variously planned to renovate it, develop it, convert it, and never did any of those things. The current owner was a property development company out of Columbus that had acquired it 18 months ago as part of a package deal involving 3 other Carvers Creek properties. Their intention was to gut the interior and convert it to mixed-use retail and residential. The salvage and demolition prep had been contracted to a company called Midwest Strip and Clear, which was where Joel Marsh came in. Joel was 29 years old. He had worked for Midwest Strip and Clear for 4 years, since coming back to Ohio after a construction management degree that had not led, as smoothly as advertised, to construction management work. He was the kind of employee who was trusted with solo jobs, buildings that needed methodical, careful stripping rather than brute speed, buildings where the contents had potential value that required assessment rather than simple removal. His supervisor described him, in the particular language of the trades, as someone who paid attention, which was true. Joel paid attention to things. It was his most consistent quality, and the one that had, so far in his life, been more useful than almost anything else. He had arrived at the WCKR building on a Monday morning with a work order, a toolkit, and a clipboard. The work order specified full interior strip, all fixed equipment and built-ins to be removed and assessed for salvage value, structural elements to remain intact for contractor assessment. Estimated duration 5 to 7 days. He started on the ground floor. The reception area first, a dropped ceiling he took down panel by panel, a built-in reception desk in pressboard and laminate that came apart in sections, fluorescent light fixtures, electrical conduit. Standard mid-century commercial interior, nothing unusual. He photographed everything before moving it, logged the salvage assessment on his clipboard, stacked materials in the parking lot for collection. The broadcast booth was more interesting. The original equipment had been removed when the station closed, the console, the turntables, the transmission gear, but the acoustic treatment remained. Panels of compressed fiberglass wrapped in fabric, mounted to the walls and ceiling in the specific configuration of a professionally designed recording environment. The panels were 50 years old, and the fabric had discolored but the acoustic material itself was intact, and Joel noted it as potentially salvageable for recording studio applications. He removed them carefully, one by one, and stacked them. Behind the last panel on the north wall of the broadcast booth, he found the cavity. It was not a structural void. That was the first thing he registered. Not a gap between studs, not a chase for conduit. This had been deliberately created. The wall had been opened, the interior modified, and then closed again with the acoustic panel covering the opening. Someone had used the panel as a door, essentially, though it was not designed as one and was not hinged or fitted with a latch. It simply rested in its mount, covering an opening approximately 18 inches wide and 2 feet tall, at a height of about 4 feet from the floor. Inside the cavity, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a professional-grade machine, the kind used in broadcast facilities in the 1960s and 1970s. It had been placed inside the cavity on a shelf that had been constructed specifically for it, a simple wooden platform screwed into the studs, level and stable. The machine was dusty but intact. The power cable was coiled beside it, unplugged. A single reel of tape was loaded on the machine, threaded through the heads, the take-up reel empty, the tape waiting at what appeared to be the beginning. Joel looked at it for a long time. Then he photographed it. Then he photographed the cavity. Then he photographed the wall from the outside to document the panel placement. He did this before touching anything, because paying attention meant documenting before acting, and because something about the specific deliberateness of what he was looking at, the constructed shelf, the covered opening, the loaded tape waiting to be played, told him this was not something that had been put here casually. He pulled the machine out carefully, set it on the floor of the broadcast booth, found the nearest live outlet. There were still a few in the building, the power not yet disconnected, and plugged in the cable. He pressed play. Danny Beaumont's voice filled the empty broadcast booth. The recording was 47 minutes and 22 seconds long. Joel sat on the floor of the gutted room and listened to all of it without moving. The boy spoke with the careful, slightly stilted delivery of someone who had been coached on what to say and was trying to say it correctly. But underneath the coached quality, something else, the specific urgency of a child who has seen something they don't have the adult vocabulary to fully describe and is trying very hard to make themselves understood anyway. He described what he had seen on the night of October 11th, 1974, 3 nights before the recording was made. He had been in the woods behind his house, which he acknowledged he was not supposed to be. It was past his bedtime. He had snuck out. He was very specific about this, and the specificity had the quality of a child who has been told that telling the truth about the small transgression will make the big thing more believable. He had been in the woods because he had heard a sound and gone to investigate, because he was 8 years old, and sounds in the woods at night were interesting rather than frightening. He described what he saw in the clearing. He described the men, 3 of them. He described their clothing, 2 in work clothes, 1 in what he called a church shirt, meaning a button-down. He described the light source, a lantern, he said, the kind that runs on fuel, not batteries. He described what the men were doing with the same matter-of-fact precision that children sometimes bring to describing things they have witnessed without fully understanding, the precision of a camera rather than a narrator. He described one of the men's faces, in detail, the way his nose bent to one side, the way his hair was cut, a scar on his chin that caught the lantern light. And then he said the man's name. Not a first name, a full name, first and last, spoken with the confidence of a child who knows this person, who has seen this person in the ordinary contexts of small-town life, who has no reason to think the name would be significant except that something told him to say it, to put it on the record, to make sure someone knew. Joel sat very still on the floor of the broadcast booth after the tape ended. Outside, Carver's Creek continued its Tuesday morning. Traffic on Elm Street, the sound of a delivery truck on 4th, the ordinary sounds of a town that had been living with an unanswered question for 50 years. The question had just been answered, on a tape inside a wall, in a voice that had been 8 years old when it spoke and had been sealed in here ever since. He called his supervisor first, not the police, his supervisor, because that was the protocol for unexpected discoveries on job sites, and because Joel Marsh was the kind of person who followed protocols even when the protocols seemed inadequate to the situation. His supervisor, a man named Garrett who had been running Midwest Strip and Clear for 15 years and had the specific unflappability of someone who had seen most things that could happen on a job site, listened to the summary without interrupting. Then he said, "Don't touch anything else. Call the police. I'll be there in 2 hours." Joel called the police. The dispatcher who answered had the standard dispatcher's quality of professional calm that is trained to not respond to the emotional register of the caller, only the informational content. Joel gave her the address. He said he had found a recording device inside a wall cavity during a demolition prep job. He said the recording appeared to be relevant to a missing persons case from 1974. He said the name on the case was Danny Beaumont. A pause on the line, longer than standard. "Can you repeat that name?" the dispatcher said. He repeated it. Another pause. "Stay where you are," she said. "Don't touch anything. Someone will be there shortly." Shortly turned out to be 11 minutes. 2 patrol cars and 6 minutes behind them, an unmarked vehicle that discharged a detective in her mid-40s. Compact build, dark hair cut short and practical, a grey blazer over dark trousers, the expression of someone who had been called away from something else and had already been briefed on the drive over. Her name was Detective Karen Solis. She had been with the Carvers Creek Police Department for 18 years. She looked at Joel. She looked at the machine on the floor of the broadcast booth. She looked at the cavity in the wall. She said, "Walk me through exactly how you found it. Everything. In order." Joel walked her through it. She listened with the complete attention of someone for whom the sequence of events was not just interesting but evidentially critical. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both precise. She did not touch the machine. When he finished, she looked at the cavity again. "Danny Beaumont," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "You listened to the full recording?" "Yes." "He gives a name at the end." Joel looked at her. "You know about this case." "Everyone who's been on this department more than 10 years knows about this case," she said. She looked at the machine. "We just never had anything to work with." Detective Solis called the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation from the parking lot of the WCKR building. Joel watched her through the building's front window. She was on the phone for 22 minutes, walking a slow rectangle in the parking lot, the gray blazer catching the October light, her free hand making the occasional precise gesture of someone conveying specific technical information to someone who needs to act on it. She came back inside. "BCI is sending a forensic audio unit," she said. "They'll be here tomorrow morning. Until then, nothing in this room gets touched. I'm going to need you to give a full written statement today." "Okay," Joel said. "The recording. At the end, the name he gives. You're certain of what you heard?" "Yes." She nodded. Something in her expression that was not quite anything he could name. Not excitement, not satisfaction. Those were the wrong registers for this specific situation. Something more like the expression of someone who has been carrying an open question for a very long time and has just been handed the first piece of an answer and is trying to be professional about the weight of it. "The man whose name is on that tape," Joel said carefully, "is he—" "I can't discuss active case information with you," Solis said. "What I can tell you is that your statement is going to matter. The chain of evidence from the moment you found this machine to right now, every detail of it matters. So I need you to be as precise as you can." He gave the statement at the precinct that afternoon. 2 hours, a detective taking notes, Joel going through everything in the order it happened. The acoustic panel, the cavity, the shelf, the machine, the tape already loaded, the play button, the voice. He described the voice with the specific care of someone who understood that how he described it, the quality of it, the age of it, the urgency of it, was part of the record now, part of what would eventually be set against everything else in whatever process followed. When he described the moment the boy said his own name, "My name is Danny Beaumont," the detective taking notes stopped writing for a half-second, then resumed. Professional. But that half-second was there. The forensic audio unit arrived at 8:15 the following morning. 2 technicians and a specialist, equipment in cases that they carried with the careful efficiency of people who did this work regularly and understood that the physical handling of the evidence was as important as the technical analysis of it. They worked in the broadcast booth for 6 hours. Joel was not present for most of it. He had been asked to remain available, but not in the building during the technical examination. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and ate a sandwich at noon that he didn't taste, and called his supervisor to update the work order status. At 2:40, Detective Solis came out of the building and walked to his truck. She stood beside the driver's window. He rolled it down. "The recording is authentic," she said. "The tape dates to the early 1970s. The machine dates to the same period. The audio content is consistent with a recording made in late 1974. BCI is satisfied with the chain of evidence from your discovery this morning." Joel nodded. "The name on the tape," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The October light was flat and even, the sky the specific white-gray of Ohio in mid-autumn. "The individual named on the recording died in 2019, she said carefully. "However, this case has implications beyond that individual. There are other people, other questions. The case is being reopened as of this morning." Joel looked at the building, at the brick facade of the WCKR building, which had been sitting on the corner of Elm and 4th since 1948, holding what it held, waiting. "Who put it in the wall?" Joel said. "That's one of the questions we're now working to answer," Solis said. The answer to that question took 3 weeks and arrived not through the police investigation, but through a phone call Joel received on a Thursday evening from a woman he had never heard of, who had heard about him through a chain of connections he could not entirely reconstruct, and who said, "I think my father put that machine in the wall, and I think it's time someone knew why." Her name was Patricia Wells. She was 67 years old. She had grown up in Carver's Creek and left in 1981 and not come back except for funerals. She lived in Cincinnati now, had for 40 years, and she had a voice on the phone that had the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a particular phone call for a very long time, and is now, unexpectedly, the one making it. Her father had been the chief engineer at WCKR from 1962 until the station closed in 1991. His name was Robert Wells. He had died in 2003. She told Joel that in October 1974, a boy had come to the station. A boy she remembered. She had been 22 at the time, working at the station part-time as a receptionist while her father ran the technical operations. The boy had come to the station because he wanted to record something, because he had seen something, and he wanted it to be on tape because tape was real, tape lasted, tape couldn't be argued with the way a child's spoken word could be argued with. Her father had let him in, had set him up in the booth, had run the machine himself because the boy didn't know how, and had recorded what the boy had to say. "Did your father know what was on the recording?" Joel said. "He knew," Patricia said. "He listened to it while the boy was still there. He knew exactly what it meant and exactly who the name meant and exactly what would happen if that recording became known." "What would have happened?" A pause. "The man named on that tape," Patricia said carefully, "was not someone you accused in Carver's Creek in 1974 without consequences. He was connected. He had been connected for a long time. My father was not a brave man. He was honest, but he was not brave, and he understood the difference. He understood that doing the right thing and surviving the right thing were not the same thing in this specific situation. So he hid it. He hid it. He built the shelf. He covered the opening with the acoustic panel. He put the machine in there and left the tape loaded and told himself that someday the situation would change, that the man would die or leave, or that something would shift and it would be safe to bring it out. But he never did. He never did. He died in 2003, and the man named on that tape didn't die until 2019. And by the time the man died, my father had been gone 16 years, and nobody knew the machine was in the wall except my father and me. You knew. He told me in 1989, when he was diagnosed with something serious that turned out not to kill him but that scared him badly enough to tell me. He said, "If something happens to me, there's something in the wall of the broadcast booth that matters." He described where it was. He told me what was on it. He made me promise not to touch it while the man was alive. And after the man died? Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I drove to Carver's Creek in 2020, she said. A year after he died. I stood outside the building for 45 minutes, and then I drove home. Because I didn't know how to walk in and say, 'I've known about this for 30 years, and I didn't say anything.' I didn't know how to be the person who knew and didn't say anything, so I didn't go in." She paused. "And then I heard that someone had found it anyway, that a young man stripping the building had found the machine and pressed play. And I thought, someone did the thing I couldn't do. Someone was brave enough just by doing their job carefully." Joel looked at his hands on the steering wheel. He was parked outside his apartment in Columbus, the Thursday evening traffic on the street outside. "I need you to talk to Detective Solis," he said. "I know," Patricia said. "That's why I called." Patricia Wells drove to Carver's Creek on a Saturday. She had not been back in 11 years. She met with Detective Solis for 4 hours at the precinct, giving a statement that Solis later described, in the careful language of police procedure, as significantly advancing the investigation. Joel was not present for that meeting. He had returned to work. The WCKR building was now an active crime scene, and his job there was on hold. But Midwest Strip and Clear had other sites, and Garrett had assigned him to a warehouse job in Dayton that was straightforward and physically demanding, and gave him something to do with the specific restlessness he had been carrying since the Tuesday morning he pressed play on a machine pulled from a wall. He thought about Danny Beaumont. He had been 8 years old in October 1974. He had seen something in the woods behind his house. He had gone to a radio station because he wanted his voice on tape, because he understood at 8 years old that tape was real in a way that a child's spoken word was not, that the machine made you credible in a way that just talking didn't. He had been right about that. He had been entirely, precisely right. The tape was real. The tape had survived 50 years in a wall cavity and still played, and the voice on it was clear, and the name it contained was legible. He had been 8 years old, and he had understood exactly what he needed to do, and he had done it. 5 days later, he had disappeared. He had never been found. Joel thought about that gap. The 5 days between October 14th and October 19th, between the recording and the disappearance. The recording existed because Danny Beaumont understood he might not be believed if he simply told someone. The disappearance happened 5 days later. The connection between those two facts was the question that the reopened investigation was now working to answer, slowly, through the processes available to it. He drove to Dayton. He stripped a warehouse. He paid attention to things, which was his most consistent quality. At night, in the motel the company put him in for the duration of the Dayton job, he thought about the specific courage of an 8-year-old boy who had seen something terrible and had not been paralyzed by it, but had instead gone to the place in his town where voices were recorded and asked to have his recorded. He thought about Robert Wells, the chief engineer, who had built a shelf and hidden a machine, and spent 29 years telling himself the situation would change, that the moment would come, that it would eventually be safe, and had died in 2003 with the machine still in the wall and the moment never having arrived. He thought about Patricia Wells, who had driven to Carver's Creek in 2020 and sat outside the building for 45 minutes and then gone home, who had known for 30 years and had not been able to find the way in. And he thought about himself. A 29-year-old stripping a building on a Tuesday, paying attention the way he always paid attention, removing an acoustic panel from a wall and finding a cavity and looking at what was inside the cavity before deciding what to do with it. He had not been brave. He had just done his job carefully. He had paid attention. He had pressed play. That was all. But sometimes that was everything. The investigation moved at the pace of investigations, which is to say in ways that were not linear and not publicly narrated, and whose progress Joel tracked through occasional calls from Detective Solis and through the local news coverage that periodically surfaced as the case generated developments that reached the threshold of public reporting. The man named on the tape had a son. The son was in his mid-50s, a businessman in Columbus, entirely unaware, or claiming to be entirely unaware, of the events of October 1974. He retained legal representation within 48 hours of the case being reopened. The legal representation was expensive, which told its own story, though legal representation in a case involving a deceased parent was not, by itself, evidence of anything. The clearing in the woods behind the Beaumont family's former house, the family had long since moved away, the house was owned by someone else now, was examined by a BCI forensic team. The ground had been disturbed many times in 50 years by weather and root systems and the ordinary processes of a forest reclaiming its own, and what the forensic team found or did not find was not disclosed publicly, which was standard for an active investigation and which Joel understood as a professional matter even as he found it, personally, difficult. Danny Beaumont's mother was still alive. She was 81 years old, living in a nursing home in a town 40 miles from Carver's Creek. She had been informed that the case had been reopened. She had been informed that a recording existed. She had been informed by a victim assistance officer who made the trip specifically for this conversation that her son's voice was on that recording, that he had been 8 years old when he made it, that he had been careful and precise and had done everything right. The officer's account of that conversation, relayed to Solis and through Solis to Joel in the careful professional language of someone reporting an observed response. The woman had sat very still for a long time. Then she had asked if she could hear it. The officer had said that was something to discuss with the investigative team. The woman had said, "I just want to hear his voice. I haven't heard his voice in 50 years. Joel thought about that for a long time. About a woman who had been 31 years old in October 1974 when her son disappeared, who had spent 50 years not knowing, who would now know some things and not others, who would have a recording but not an ending, who would hear her child's voice at 8 years old saying, "My name is Danny Beaumont," and then saying what he saw and then saying the name. Some answers create other questions. Some truths arrive incomplete. Some things that have been sealed in walls for 50 years, when finally opened, do not resolve everything but resolve enough. Enough for the record, enough for the accounting, enough for an 81-year-old woman to hear her son's voice one more time. That had to be enough. And in some specific, limited, important way, it was. Joel finished the Dayton job in 8 days. He drove back to Columbus on a Friday evening through the Ohio darkness, the highway lights marking the distance, the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from physical work done well over a sustained period. His phone buzzed as he pulled into his parking lot. A message from Detective Solis. Short. The BCI audio team confirmed the recording is being formally entered into evidence. Chain of custody complete from your discovery. You did everything right. Thank you. He sat in the parked car and read it twice. Then he got out of the car and went upstairs to his apartment and made something to eat and sat at the kitchen table with the specific quiet of someone who has been part of something significant and is now, correctly, on the outside of it, a witness to the beginning of something rather than a participant in its conclusion, which was the right position for someone whose role had been to find it and press play, and then step back and let the people with the standing and the training and the authority do what needed to be done. He thought about the empty broadcast booth, about the acoustic panels stacked in the parking lot, about the cavity in the north wall with its constructed shelf and its absent machine, about the specific quality of the silence in the room after the tape ended and Danny Beaumont's voice stopped and the reels turned on empty tape for a few seconds before he reached over and pressed stop. He had pressed stop. He had sat with what he heard. He had followed the protocol, called his supervisor, called the police, stayed where he was, told the truth in order, documented everything. He had paid attention. He went back to work on Monday. Midwest Strip and Clear had a church in Akron, a commercial building in Youngstown, a former bank in Zanesville that the owner thought might have architectural salvage value in the original vault fittings. Standard work, methodical work, buildings that needed careful stripping rather than brute speed. He carried his clipboard. He photographed everything before touching it. He assessed before acting. He opened the things that needed opening and looked carefully at what was inside. That was the job. That had always been the job. He was good at it. And sometimes, not often, not as a rule, not in any way that could be anticipated or planned for, being good at the job meant finding something that had been waiting 50 years for someone to pay enough attention to find it. He drove to Akron. He started on the ground floor. He paid attention. Have you ever found something that had been waiting for exactly the right person to find it? Have you ever been the unexpected answer to a question someone else had been asking for decades? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe that paying attention is its own form of courage, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, more voices that waited in walls, in boxes, in the ordinary places that careful people find when they do their jobs right. Some truths wait 50 years, and then someone presses play. End of story. The Real. 50,000 characters. Original work. 3 months after the discovery, Patricia Wells called Joel again. Not about the investigation. She had given her statement. She had done what needed to be done through the proper channels, and the investigation itself had moved into a phase that no longer required her participation and whose developments she followed at a careful distance, the way people follow things that involve them personally but are no longer in their hands. She called because she wanted to tell him something about his grandfather. Joel did not understand the connection immediately. He said, "I don't follow you." She said, "Robert Wells, my father, and Marsh. Your name is Joel Marsh." He said, "Yes." She said, "There was a man named Marsh who came to the station sometimes in the late 1970s. A friend of my father's, I think, or something close to a friend. The kind of friendship that develops between men who share a specific thing and don't talk about it directly. He was older than my father. He came maybe twice a year. He would sit with my father in the engineering room and they would drink coffee and talk about things I was not present for." Joel said, "My grandfather's name was Harold Marsh. He died in 1981. Patricia said, "I know. My father mentioned it. He mentioned it in the context of, I remember this specifically, I was 19 and I was home for a school break and I overheard them talking, my father and someone on the phone. He said, 'Harold Marsh died.' That's 2 of us now who know, and neither of us can say it." Joel was quiet on the line. His grandfather, Harold Marsh, had lived in Carver's Creek his entire life. He had been a high school biology teacher for 30 years. He had died of a heart attack in 1981 when Joel was not yet born, and was known to Joel only through photographs and the specific warmth of the way his father spoke about him. A quiet man, a patient man, the kind of person who listened more than he talked. What did my grandfather know? Joel said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I don't know everything, she said carefully. But I think he was in the woods that night. Not one of the men my father described from the tape. Not one of the three. Someone else. Someone who saw something different from what Danny Beaumont saw, or saw the same thing from a different position. My father never told me directly, but the way he talked about Harold Marsh after he died, the way he said that's two of us who know, it was the way you talk about someone who shared a specific weight with you. Someone who was also carrying something they couldn't put down. Joel thought about his grandfather, about a biology teacher in a small Ohio town who had died in 1981 at the age of 54, which was young, which had always been presented to Joel as simply the way of things, a heart attack, genetics, bad luck. He thought about the specific weight of carrying something you cannot say for 7 years, from 1974 to 1981, and then dying with it. Did your father ever say what my grandfather wanted to do? Joel said. Whether he wanted to come forward? My father said, Patricia said, that Harold Marsh had gone to the police in 1975, anonymously. He had called the tip line they set up after Danny disappeared and told them to look at the clearing behind the Beaumont house. He didn't give his name. He didn't say what he'd seen or who had been there. He just said, look at the clearing. And they looked. They looked. They found nothing. The clearing had been cleaned. By the time the police got there was nothing to find. Joel was quiet for a long time. He tried, Joel said finally. He tried the way people try when they're afraid, Patricia said. Anonymously, indirectly, in a way that wouldn't expose them, but might still do something. It didn't do anything. And he spent the rest of his life knowing it hadn't done anything, and knowing what he knew, and not being able to say it. She paused. Your grandfather was a good man, she said. My father said that. More than once. He said Harold Marsh was a good man who was in an impossible position and did what he could with it, which wasn't enough, but it was what he had. Joel sat with that for a long time after he hung up. He sat with it, and he thought about the specific inheritance of a town's silences, about what gets carried in families without being named, the particular quality of a grandfather's quietness, the way a history teacher drinks his coffee in the morning before saying anything, the way certain men of a certain generation in certain places develop a stillness that could be mistaken for contentment and is not entirely not contentment, but is also the specific weight of knowing things that have nowhere to go. He thought about the fact that he had ended up in the WCKR building on a Monday morning with a work order and a clipboard, about the series of unremarkable decisions that had led him there, the degree that didn't lead to construction management, the job at Midwest Strip and Clear, the assignment to the WCKR building specifically because Garrett trusted him with jobs that required attention. He thought about Patricia Wells driving to Carver's Creek in 2020 and sitting outside the building for 45 minutes and then driving home. About what it had taken, or rather, what it had not taken, because it had taken nothing from him, just the ordinary performance of a job he was good at, to do the things she had been unable to do. He thought about his grandfather going to the tip line in 1975 and saying, look at the clearing, and the police going to the clearing and finding nothing, and Harold Marsh spending 6 more years carrying what he carried until his heart stopped at 54. He thought about a recording made by an 8-year-old boy who understood that the machine made you credible, who had been right about that, who had been entirely precisely right about that, and had not survived to know it. Some things travel through families. Some silences have shapes. Some weights are carried by one generation and set down by the next, without either generation knowing that was the arrangement. Joel Marsh had pressed play. His grandfather, Harold Marsh, had called the tip line and said, look at the clearing. Neither of them had been able to finish it. But together, across 46 years and the gap between the living and the dead, they had moved it forward. They had pushed it closer to the place where it needed to go. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything available to them. and it had been enough. Detective Solis called in the spring. The investigation had concluded its primary phase. She gave Joel the information she was permitted to give, which was less than he wanted and more than he had expected. A civil proceeding had been initiated against the estate of the man named on the tape. The findings of the investigation had been referred to the county prosecutor's office for review of any surviving individuals with potential criminal exposure. That process was ongoing, and she could not comment further on it. Danny Beaumont's remains had been located. She said this carefully, in the specific language of someone who has delivered this kind of news before and understands what it means to the people receiving it. The clearing behind the former Beaumont house. The forensic team's second examination, with additional equipment and additional information from the investigation's findings. Spring ground after the winter, which changes what is findable. The details were not public, and she was not at liberty to share them, but she wanted him to know because his discovery had made this possible. She said, "His mother heard the recording. I was present. It took a long time to arrange and required significant care, and I can't tell you what she said or what the room was like, but she heard it." Joel said, "I'm glad." She said, "I am too." She said one more thing before she ended the call. She said, "The machine is going to the County Historical Archive when the evidentiary process concludes. The tape will go with it, properly preserved, properly catalogued. Danny Beaumont's voice will be in the permanent record, accessible, not sealed in a wall." Joel said, "Thank you." She said, "Thank you." He drove to work. A former textile mill in Mansfield, long closed, the owner wanting to convert it to loft apartments. Full interior strip, all fixed equipment and built-ins to be removed and assessed for salvage value. Estimated duration, 10 to 14 days. He started on the ground floor. He photographed everything before touching it. He removed the built-ins carefully, one section at a time, logging each piece on his clipboard. He looked behind the things he removed before moving to the next thing, which was not strictly required by the work order, but which was the way he worked. Paying attention. In the spring light of a Mansfield morning, in the specific smell of an old industrial building giving up its decades of accumulated dust, Joel Marsh worked carefully through a gutted room. Some voices wait 50 years to be heard. Some truths live in walls until the right hands find them. And some jobs, routine, methodical, unglamorous, the work of someone whose supervisor described him as someone who paid attention, turn out to be the last link in a chain that started before the person doing the job was born. He pulled an acoustic panel from a wall. He looked at what was behind it. Plaster. Just plaster. He made a note on his clipboard. Moved to the next one. The County Historical Archive received the machine in August. Joel drove to Carver's Creek for the occasion. Nobody had asked him to. There was no ceremony, no formal event. It was an archival transfer, a procedural step, the kind of thing that happens in a back room with two archivists and a chain of custody form. He drove there anyway, because it felt like the right thing to do, which was the kind of reasoning he did not usually apply to his actions, but which, in this specific case, seemed sufficient justification. He parked on Elm Street and walked to the corner of 4th. The WCKR building was still standing. The demolition prep work had been suspended during the investigation and had not yet resumed. The windows were dark. The brick facade was the same brick it had always been, entirely unremarkable from the outside, the way buildings are unremarkable from the outside while holding what they hold inside. He did not go in. He stood on the corner for a few minutes and looked at it. Then he walked to the county archive on the other side of town, a modest building attached to the public library, and he introduced himself to the archivist at the front desk and said he was the person who had found the machine in the WCKR building, and he wanted to confirm it had arrived safely. The archivist was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the specific organized energy of someone who had been responsible for the permanent preservation of things for a long time, and took it seriously. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone placing a name with a context she already had. "We've been expecting you might come by," she said. She came around the counter. "Would you like to see it?" He followed her through a door and down a short corridor to a climate-controlled room at the back of the building. The room held rows of metal shelving, archive boxes in standard sizes labeled in careful handwriting, the specific dense quiet of a place whose purpose was the slowing of time. The machine was on a shelf near the end of the first row, in an open archival box with acid-free padding, labeled in the same careful handwriting, WCKR radio station, reel-to-reel recording device, 1974, Carver's Creek Case Archive. Beside it, in a separate sealed container, the tape. Joel looked at both of them for a long time, at the machine that had sat in a wall for 30 years and waited, at the tape that had been loaded and ready and patient in a way that machines are patient, without consciousness, without effort, simply by remaining intact. "We're going to have the tape digitized," the archivist said, "properly, with full technical documentation. The audio will be preserved in multiple formats. The original tape will remain here in controlled conditions indefinitely." "And accessible?" Joel said. "Eventually? The case documentation will remain sealed for the duration of any active legal proceedings. After that, yes, accessible, properly catalogued, part of the permanent record." Joel nodded. Part of the permanent record. Danny Beaumont's voice, 8 years old, careful, urgent, precisely right, in the permanent record of the county he had lived in and disappeared from. Not sealed in a wall, not waiting, present, accessible, real in the way that the boy had understood, at 8 years old, that tape made things real. He had been right about that. He had been entirely right. Joel thanked the archivist. She walked him back to the front of the building. At the door, she stopped and looked at him with the expression of someone who has something to say and has decided to say it. "The recordings we preserve here," she said, "most of them are official, institutional, minutes of meetings, public proceedings, things that were made to be preserved. What you found, that's different. That's a recording made by a child who understood something specific about what recording meant and acted on it. That's rare. That's—" She paused, choosing the word. "That's someone doing exactly the right thing with what they had. We take that seriously here." Joel said, "He was 8 years old." She said, "I know." He walked back to his truck on Elm Street. The October light was the same light it always was in Ohio in autumn, flat and honest, the particular light of a season that doesn't perform anything, that is simply what it is. He drove home to Columbus. He told his father about the call from Patricia Wells, about Harold Marsh going to the tip line in 1975, about the two of us who know. His father was 61 years old. He sat at his kitchen table and listened to the full account without interrupting, which was the way Harold Marsh's son had always listened to things, fully, patiently, with the specific quality of attention that Joel had inherited and used without knowing where it came from. When Joel finished, his father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I always wondered why he was so quiet. My father. I was 12 when he died, and I remembered him as a quiet man, and I thought that was just who he was. But sometimes I thought there was a specific thing underneath the quiet. Not sadness, something more like weight, like someone who was always carrying something just below the surface." Joel said, "He tried. He called the tip line. He tried to do something without exposing himself, and it didn't work, and he spent 6 years knowing it hadn't worked." His father looked at his hands on the kitchen table. The same hands as Harold Marsh in the photographs Joel had seen, the same shape, the same proportions. He said, "You're more like him than I realized." Joel said, "What do you mean?" His father said, "The attention, the way you pay attention to things. I always thought that was just you. But maybe it's older than you. Maybe it's something that's been in this family for a while, looking for the right moment. Joel thought about that, about the specific inheritance of a quality rather than a name or a property or a formal bequest, about the way certain things pass through generations, not through instruction, but through example, through the accumulated observation of watching someone be a certain way and becoming that way yourself without noticing the transmission. Harold Marsh had paid attention. He had been in the wrong place in 1974, or the right place, depending on how you measured it. He had seen what he saw. He had done what he could do with it, which was not enough, but which was what he had. And 46 years later, his grandson had been in a building on a Monday morning with a clipboard and had paid attention to the specific weight of a cavity behind an acoustic panel, and had pressed play and had done what came next with care and precision, and the specific ordinary bravery of someone who simply does not stop paying attention when stopping would be easier. The family had been moving toward this moment for 46 years. Neither of them had known it. Both of them had contributed to it. That was how it worked, Joel thought. Not the dramatic version, not the version where someone makes a heroic choice in a decisive moment. The quiet version. The version where a quality passes from person to person through the decades and one day arrives in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, and someone presses play. He stayed for dinner. His father made soup, the way Harold Marsh had apparently made soup, with the specific methodical attention of someone who believed that doing simple things correctly was its own form of meaning. They ate together. They talked about other things. The family history hung in the air between them, present, no longer sealed. Some things needed to be opened. Some walls needed to come down. Some voices had been waiting 50 years for a 29-year-old with a clipboard and a habit of paying attention to do exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. He drove home through the Columbus evening. He went to work on Monday. He paid attention.